Some people say royalty companies have no leverage. You know, when the price of gold goes up a lot, an operating company, theoretically, should have a lot of leverage. If I'm producing gold at $1,200 an ounce and gold is $1,300 an ounce, and then so I have a $100 margin, gold goes to $1,400, which is less than a 10% increase, my margin doubles. So operating companies have a lot of leverage, theoretically, although I've shown or suggested that they don't. Royalty companies, it's said, don't.
Listening to Adrian Day's speech there at Sprott 2018, and he says something about how operating companies, gold mining companies, have substantial leverage in theory, whereas royalty companies don't. A couple things occur to me, one of which is simple enough. If the mining company is trying to maximize profit, subject to a profitability constraint, then yeah, assuming the cost structure doesn't change, the operator has a lot of leverage. If you go from a margin of 0 to something positive, or a margin of 1 unit to 2 units, those are pretty substantial gains. Technically speaking, it's piecewise linear, but if you smooth it out with any kind of valuation metric that averages across different possible scenarios in any way, you get some kind of convex thing that has an increasing slope. Generally, that's possible, and if your slope is increasing all the time and is positive, then that's what an increasing margin is. It's convexity, so that's leverage that Adrian's talking about for operating. Anyways, well, that's a lot of work to figure out. One thing to say it, another thing to show it. But the numbers make sense there, and the logic, the street wisdom at least is familiar enough, which is simply, as Mr. Adrian Day says in the recording, quite noteworthy. I might just play an excerpt of that. Just around the 9:30 mark there in his speech, he says these things, and the second thing he says is interesting too. Yeah, it's a funny statement, but he says, possibly with a hint of irony or questioning in his voice, the statement being something like, royalty payoff profiles don't have convexity, or more simply, royalties don't have leverage. And so I'd like to illustrate a basic case where that's not true, as a hypothetical. So it's a bit of a thought experiment, but give it a shot. So your revenue equation is P times Q, right? Price times quantity. And an NSR, net smelter return, royalty provides kind of like a gross metal, or a gross revenue almost. It's before costs, right? So we can talk about costs, and I'd point out in passing that the first point about production companies having leverage hinges on the fact that costs don't change. If costs change with prices, then you're going to have to revisit that street wisdom, because it's not necessarily accurate. And if your Q, if P, if your equation is R revenues P times Q, and your Q varies with P, then, you know, again, take pause and note what could possibly happen. Now, simply put, you know, R again can denote royalty, and if we're talking about a world where royalties have leverage, then that P times Q thing needs to be increasing more quickly than the linear, because leverage and convexity are meant to be the same thing. So all you need of that is to have some sense of what a derivative would look like on that Q of P function. It's kind of hard to say, you know, in general, because who says that Q of P is well defined in any meaningful way? But assuming it is, assuming there's some equation for it, all you need is first derivative to be positive, and you get your convexity, I believe. So that's cool. And what does an increasing Q of P look like? First derivative positive just means you are a mining company who increases your quantity of production as the price increases. Not bad, hey? And to be a royalty owner on a mine that increases in that kind of way, compounding, exponential, whatever way you want to describe it, you know, the ability to do that is pretty special. So it all may sound a bit confusing and esoteric and unnecessary, but it allows you to say things like, no, it's not fair to say that royalties have no leverage. In fact, the case can be made where all that's required for a royalty to have leverage is for the underlying mine scenario to be increasing production in price, which is a hugely bullish concept, really. You know, reflect on that, right? Like, not only is, you know, it bullish from an operational perspective, you know, the ability to increase production in a rising price environment requires the discipline to cut when prices are low. Again, just kind of logical, converse statements, reasoning through the logic tables and the model is pretty simple and leads to some important stuff. Stuff I've heard before from Gerald Whittle, for sure. Shout out Whittle Consulting out of Australia. Super cool. And yeah, I know Gerald makes a point of nitpicking people on what they do in response to price, what they say they would do. One example of a noteworthy figure in the Vancouver community who said that they would decrease average grades in a rising price environment. Gerald pointed that out to me. I thought it was quite funny because, yes, it does indeed stand to reason that decreasing grades, decreasing cutoff average grade mined through processed material, you know, can end up decreasing total metal production, increasing costs and stuff like that, which isn't what you want to be doing when prices go up. So first order, second order, so on, pretty basic stuff. I don't know that it's particularly contentious, but helps to point it out in simple terms. And yeah, again, to those couple points from Adrian Day at the 2018 Sprott Symposium, where he talks about how operating miners supposedly have all the leverage and royalties don't have leverage. And I just say again that a couple things to note with regards to that is that a royalty can have leverage if the mine it's based on has an increasing, production profile with conditional and rising prices. That's one thing to say, in theory. Executing on that operationally is another question. And it should not be taken for granted that it's possible. Or standard practice. And the other thing I'd point out is just that assuming operating companies have great leverage largely hinges on the idea that the costs aren't changing. And so in the example Adrian points out, he calculates a net income number for a mine and says, if the price before it goes from $1,200 to $1,400 and your costs stay the same at $1,000, your margins have doubled from $200 to $400. And he's not wrong, but I would point out clearly that he's assumed the costs have not changed. So, in the same way that I've analyzed the revenue equation for the royalty, you can include costs in there too and start to ask, what's the shape of the cost curve? Does it change with prices in some way? It's kind of a strange concept, but not altogether unrealistic, because a lot of what drives metals prices is kind of like industrial price inflation, infrastructure build-out cost inflation, stuff like that, because metals prices in heavy industry. And having inflation in heavy industry, metals prices themselves, it can transfer into the input costs for mining, because mining is a heavy industry process itself, and it feeds, the production of it feeds into further industrial processes, and there's a whole system that's required to get those heavy-duty mining operations into production in the first place, right? So talking about a general rise in the price of metals, mining, metal output and input together is not unreasonable. And if that's happening, then you can simply see that you don't have costs flat as assumed. In fact, you could have rising costs and hence erosion in margins that has been lamented in the mining business journalist community over generations, I'm sure. Prices went up and we were supposed to make a bunch of money, but we didn't. What happened? Stuff like that. Anyways, this has been Peter Bell walking around downtown Vancouver on November 10th, 2018, talking about some badass math, finance, mining jargon, and listen on for an extended clip from the Adrian Day speech.
I just facetiously ask, how did that work for you? If you continually issue large amounts of equity, it is clear that unless you are creating value at a very rapid clip, your share price is going to go down. But as they used to say in the old television commercials, there is a better way. So, or maybe they only said it in England, I don't know. So I'm going to look at types of companies that I think offer you better risk reward than the traditional mining companies and the traditional exploration companies. You know what I'm going to be saying, but I'm going to go into a little bit of depth and look at the results. So let's look at royalty companies against the mining companies. As you can see on this table, which is taken from Franco-Nevada, if you look at the two right-hand columns, the blue and the white, basically royalty companies offer you all of the royalty companies offer you all of the advantages of operating companies in terms of yields, leverage to the gold price, we'll talk about that in a second, as well as the exploration upside, and we'll talk about that in a second. At the same time, they offer significantly reduced exposure to capital cost, operating costs, environmental costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the daily, weekly, monthly problems that operating companies have to deal with are not a problem for royalty companies. I'm not being facetious when I say the worst that can happen to a royalty company that has made an investment in a royalty is that they don't get paid for the royalty. That's, the mine doesn't come into business and they don't get paid. But they don't have the responsibility of continuing to put more capital in to fix problems. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to race through some slides. Let's look at the cash flow of some of the operating companies over the last few years, and I'll echo Matt Badiali. That was a great speech, Matt, by the way. I'll echo Matt's comment. I'm using cash flow rather than earnings for obvious reasons. So we're looking at the cash flow of some of the senior mining companies. It doesn't matter about the particular company. Don't worry about any particular excuses that a particular company might have. We're just looking at the trend. And I think you'll agree with me that the trend is pretty clear. Now let's look at the royalty companies over the same period. And again, there's ups and downs, but again, the trend over the last several years is pretty clear. So you have a sector or a subsector of a mining business that is able to increase cash flow over a period when gold is going down and over the same period when cash flow for operating companies is also going down and going down significantly. That seems to me to be a pretty attractive thing that we should be looking at. Now, royalties do have disadvantages, and I think it's incumbent upon us to look at them. We shouldn't overlook them. Number one, other people are controlling the assets. And of course, a royalty company doesn't get paid unless the mine produces, but someone else is controlling that asset. That's a pretty important disadvantage. You're not in control of your own revenue and potential. Royalties can burden projects. Some people say royalty companies have no leverage. When the price of gold goes up a lot, an operating company, theoretically, should have a lot of leverage. If I'm producing gold at $1,200 an ounce and gold is $1,300 an ounce, and then so I have a $100 margin, gold goes to $1,400, which is less than a 10% increase, my margin doubles. So operating companies have a lot of leverage, theoretically, although I've shown or suggested that they don't. Royalty companies, it's said, don't.